Okay, hopefully we are recording. Yeah, we are recording. Oh, good. Okay, guys, welcome once more to the first installment of the UQ Philosophy Seminar this semester, in semester 2 of 2024. And we are going to be opening with our first speaker, who is going to be Rebecca Hill from RMIT University. And Rebecca is a specialist in feminist philosophy, continental philosophy, and a bunch of other things. And is a senior lecturer at RMIT. And she's going to be talking to us about spirits of resistance, collective practices of freedom in, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, his prison writings. So please, Rebecca, please, take it away.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thanks for the invitation to do this talk. You can hear me and everything okay, I presume? Yeah, great.
All good, all excellent. Yeah.
Terrific. I'd like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, who are the sovereigns of this place where I'm speaking to you from. I'm speaking to you from Naarm or Melbourne. Actually, I'll just say something about the title of the paper. The reference to practices of freedom, it's a more or less a reference to Foucault, but I watched the Democrat. I've been watching a little bit of the Democratic National Convention, and I think if I'd probably prefer to change it to the word autonomy from freedom, because there's a lot of freedom. There was a lot of freedom. There was so much freedom in the rhetoric of the talk of the talk of Kamala Harris and of the entire convention, that it made me wish I had a different title. Okay, so spirits of resistance, collective practices of freedom in Behrouz Boochani's prison writings. So this paper reads Boochani's prison writing, especially his autobiographical novel, No Friend But the Mountains, and his manifesto, A Letter from Manus Island. He wrote these works while he was incarcerated in Australia's immigration detention system on Manus Island. His writing is acclaimed for its meticulous description and analysis of the atrocities and of the immigration detention regime. So in this paper, I'm arguing that his thought should also be read as a sustained thinking of collective practices of freedom. The practices of freedom Boochani articulates emerge in profound relations of feeling between people, animals, non-human animals, plants, the oceans, and winds that resist the prison, or what Boochani calls Manus prison theory. His thinking of freedom is a thinking with these forces of place, and his writing is traced with these places, these forces of place that he writes in and with. Boochani writes, the only people who can overcome and survive all of the suffering inflicted by the prison are those who exercise creativity. That is, those who can trace the melodic humming and visions from beyond the prison fences and the beehives we live in. So this paper reads the melodic humming and visions that are described here in spiritual and material terms. These are rhythms of the more than human ecosystem, and they are the basis of a collective politics of the mountains, of the birds, of the jungle, and of people who can feel and make feelings beyond the fences of Manus prison theory and its modes of subjection. Some of you may know a lot of what I'm about to say. I'm just going to provide some context about the circumstance of Boochani and the people who've been subjected to the immigration detention regime of this settler colony. So Boochani is one of thousands of people who sought asylum and found themselves subjected to incarceration by the Australian immigration regime. The policy of mandatorily detaining all people seeking asylum who arrived in Australia by boat was introduced by the Labor government in 1992 And this policy has been continued by governments of conservative and so-called progressive orientations ever since. While the Labor government, the current Labor government, has actually, there is still, I will just say that the immigration detention regime remains in place, even though there are some shifts in the policy. I think in its nature, it remains a carceral regime of control or annihilation in some respects. Immigration detention centres have been defined in government rhetoric as processing centres. And this expression, processing centres, would suggest that the people in them are being processed while their claims for refugee status are assessed. But this assessment process is Kafkaesque. A claimant's application takes many years to evaluate, and it's extremely difficult for a claimant to gain Australian residency or even to be released into the Australian community on a bridging visa. People who obtain bridging visas remain trapped in the immigration detention system because their visas are subject to renewal, which requires ongoing evaluation. People who endure the long and absurd processes of assessment only to have their cases for asylum rejected are often forcibly deported. So, in short, the spatially sequestered processing centres are prisons, and the systems of processing, evaluating, and assessing people seeking asylum make up a carceral regime of control. From July 2013, all asylum seekers arriving by boat were sent to processing centres, so-called, offshore, which is to say outside of the territorial lands of the Australian state, and told that they could never settle in Australia, even if they were legally determined to be refugees. Just days after this policy was set in place, Bachania was rescued from the ocean when the boat carrying him and dozens of other people sank off the northwest coast of Australia. He was sent to the men's immigration prison on Manus, and he spent 6 years there in detention. In 2019, he escaped to New Zealand, where he's been given political asylum. So people have died in offshore and onshore Australian immigration prisons, community detention, and under the bridging visa regime. Some people have died from readily preventable illnesses that were not treated by the private medical health companies contracted to provide care in detention. And there are many people who've committed suicide. Reza Barati, a Kurdish man, was beaten to death by prison guards on Manus. Among current and former prisoners of the migration detention system, there is pervasive illness and trauma. The Australian political establishment justifies the incarceration of asylum seekers and the demonisation of them by arguing that these people's arrivals on boats weakens the nation state's border security. As numerous activists and scholars argue and have argued, this is racist dog whistle politics in which asylum seekers are presented as a threat to our way of life. This political posturing draws from the white supremacist political mythology that is at the heart of the dominant formation of the Australian nation, or nationalism. It's integrally related to the denial of Indigenous sovereignties and to the repression or disavowal of the founding of Australia in invasion, theft, and genocide. To acknowledge Australia as a settler colony deeply upsets the master codes of Australian culture. For instance, the myth that Australia is a peaceful and democratic country. There is nonetheless, so there's a profound anxiety in this white nationalist settler myth's refusal or disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty and the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. Because even those who cling most sort of viciously to this myth, this white myth of the nation, cannot entirely reject the existence and living on of Indigenous sovereignties. So proponents of this white myth displace, I would say they displace an avowal of the illegitimate possession of the territory named Australia into aggression and hostility against First Nations peoples and towards others, other people, other places, and ideas that threaten this white myth of settler entitlement. Aggression and eliminative practices of settler colonialism are directed fundamentally at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and places and Indigenous ways of knowing, living, and belonging to country itself. The white settler myth also animates extreme hostility and aggression towards migrants and Muslims, especially, and people of colour, who are framed in this racist myth as hard to assimilate into the dominant fantasy of the white nation. The acceptance in some parts of Australia, in many parts of Australia, of this mythology is part of the justification for the indefinite incarceration of asylum seekers who come to Australia in boats. The fact that it's people who come in boats is, as Alison Ravenscroft has a paper that talks about this, that there's an anxiety. It's like particularly people coming in boats are a threat to the settler nation, whereas people coming on aeroplanes, which are in fact, of course, much more numerous, are less threatening to the Australian paranoid white imaginary. There's much more I could say about this in relation to, I think I want to get into Bachani. So the next section is called Manus Prison Theory. Bachani started to write about immigration detention when he first arrived on Manus Island. He wrote, shot video, and communicated with his collaborators in clandestine on a mobile phone because phones were subject to confiscation by prison guards in the Manus prison. He published a lot of journalism, and he published and publishes a lot of journalism, which has documented and decries the imprisonment of refugees in the Australian immigration detention system. Nonetheless, he regards journalism as an insufficient form of resistance to the system of incarceration, the immigration detention regime. He regards it as an insufficient form of resistance. He says that journalism's language of evidence and truth is too weak to convey the reality of immigration detention. He argues that creative resistance and literary language are ways of presenting this reality. They are forms of resistance that he believes allow him and others to keep what he calls human identity, despite all of the suffering inflicted by the immigration prison. The main intention of No Friend But the Mountains, he says, the main intention of No Friend But the Mountains is to describe the regime of control articulated in the Australian immigration prison. So he calls this regime Manus Prison Theory. In Manus Prison, this system dominates the lives of the men caught up in its grasp, and over time, the regime strips them of their personhood. Their possessions are confiscated, their names are replaced by numbers, and they're enclosed in an overcrowded prison that is boiling hot and filthy. There's no air conditioning and fans are ineffective. The men have no privacy from each other or from the watchful gaze of the government-contracted corporation's guards. They are subjected to a system of absurd rules. Games are banned, pens, paper, and mobile phones are banned, and they're underfed with varying quantities and qualities of food. Queuing is weaponized to induce docility and to torture. The men must queue at length for meals, toilets, showers, cigarettes, basic medicine, the telephone, and appointments with immigration officials. Worst of all, and in contrast to prisoners with convictions who've been given specified prison sentences, the men's incarceration is indefinite. In addition to, or perhaps because of, these micro and macro controls, every detainee creates what Bachani calls an emotional jail within himself. And this this atmosphere generates animosity between the men. Manus Prison Theory destroys the men's existing sense of self and turns them into prisoners. Manus Prison Theory is also productive of the subjectivity of the guards, the medical staff, kitchen workers, cleaners, translators, and immigration department bureaucrats. Bachani diagnoses racist hierarchies among the workers. This is explicit in the organisation of the guards of the multinational security company G4S. In fulfilment of the government contract, a significant proportion of the G4S guards are from PNG, some from Port Moresby, and some are Manusians. The Papuan guards are placed at the bottom of the G4S hierarchy. They wear a different colour uniform than the Australian and the New Zealand guards, and they're assigned slightly different duties. The Papuans' monthly wage is far lower than the wages of the Australian and New Zealand guards. Bachani says that unlike the Australian and New Zealander guards, the Papuans are, he claims, free spirits. He says this is especially the case among the Manusian guards, who do not internalise the disciplinary rituals and practices that turn the Australian guards and New Zealand guards into what he calls robots. He notes that over time, some of the Papuan guards form alliances with the imprisoned men. Bachani argues that Manus prison theory is not only operative in the immigration detention centre on Manus Island, it is an omnipresent regime of control in Western societies. It functions in institutions that deploy spatial sequestration and timetables, such as prisons, schools, universities, and factories. Manus prison theory also functions as mobile regimes of control that striate the lives of people wherever they go. So, for instance, the holder of a temporary protection visa is allowed to live and work in Australia according to certain restrictions, but they also remain subject to ongoing assessment and evaluation by the immigration detention apparatus. There's a piece that he published in the Saturday paper called Manus Prison Theory, where he talks about a Ken Loach film called, I think it's called I, Daniel Blake, about a man trying to access a pension because he's had heart surgery, and it's about the sort of bureaucratic nightmare that Daniel Blake goes through in trying to access this income because he's unable to work. So he talks about that. He talks about that as an example of Manus prison theory operating in England, in the world of the Ken Loach movie, and in the UK itself, of course. Aspects of Bachani's account of Manus prison theory are reminiscent of Foucault's groundbreaking analysis of the carceral society. Manus prison theory is productive of docile subjectivities and forms of power knowledge. It also naturalizes its practices, its coercive practices, as normal. But where the carceral of discipline and punish aims at a utilitarian functioning, the making of productive workers, obedient children, docile prisoners, and a myriad of delinquents who are useful to the strengthening and distribution of social forces, the aims of Manus prison theory cannot be understood in these terms. So while the spectacle of containing and punishing refugees for the settler public serves a useful political function within Australia, for the prisoners, the coercions of Manus prison theory are frequently a twisted game, irreducible to utility. So, for instance, in the afternoons, prisoners are induced to queue each day for malaria tablets, even though there's no malaria outbreak on the island. Or the health service, which is contracted to Manus prison, operates through a series of regulations which serve as what Bachani calls obstructions and diversions. So, for instance, he gives the example of gravely ill men seeking help from the corporate health service repeatedly, only to be rebuffed by staff smiling at them and dressed in white coats who suggest drinking more water and prescribing very little else except paracetamol. Bachani says these controls are maddening and profoundly damaging to the men, and sometimes these controls are lethal. So perhaps these absurd obstructions and dysfunctions are intended as a way of pressuring men to accept refoulement. But there's also a sense, it seems to me anyway, from my reading of these texts, that there's a sense in which these regulations have no goal other than their own proliferation. It's a form of capture without end for the prisoners and the workers. In this respect, Manus prison theory resonates with Franz Kafka's terrifying vision of justice as interminable and absurd in the trial. Like Kay, in his fruitless struggle to make sense of the law to which he is subject, all of the men in Manus prison on Manus Island, all of their efforts to discern the logic of Manus prison theory are thwarted. And in their very efforts to make sense of the system, to analyze the system, they become more and more enmeshed in its web. The next section is called What is Happening at the End of Corridor L? In the detention centre on Manus, Manus prison theory works to create emotional jails within the mind of each prisoner. This isolates him and breeds his animosity toward all of the other prisoners. But over time, Buchani says that everyone learns to find sanctuary in one another. The men are drawn together by their shared experience of suffering, and communities are made. At first, the dominant bond is between those who survived the same boat journey. Remember that we are GDD or MEG or KNS. He says that the collective trauma from the boat journey is in our veins. At Manus Prison, new bonds and alliances emerge on the basis of shared cultures and languages. These bonds become the most important basis of connection. Within months, prisoners start to swap rooms so that they can live among men with whom they share a common language. And while there are specific communities, there's also a growing sense of collective identity in the common experience of suffering. Brotherhood becomes a pillar of the prison that only deepens over time. Buchani's position on the activities generated by the communities in the prison is complex. In the early months of the men's incarceration, he says that some make commotions and ear-splitting noise together, which Buchani regards as a way that the men avoid coming to terms with the horror of their situation. For a man to really face his circumstances as an immigration prisoner, he must reckon with himself in solitude. Buchani thinks that the noisemakers know deep down that what they're doing is fake, but he also acknowledges that collective action is generative of feelings of camaraderie and joy that allow for some resistance to the coercions and violence of the prison. This is exemplified in the evening performances by Maysam the whore and his eccentric group of friends at the end of Corridor L. This group of Iranian men summon everyone by drumming skillfully on a plastic table that they set up as a stage. With song, drumming, and shouts, they gradually bring all the prisoners in the compound to their stage. Prisoners dance and show off and joke. The superstar of their troupe is Maysam the whore, who is always the last performer to appear. Maysam the whore is brave and creative. He wears costumes, dances, sings, and tells jokes. In one performance, he dresses as a religious leader, though he has slits cut into the sides of his garment to show off his legs while he does a rapid ass and hip-shaking dance. After wild and fast dancing, he silences his audience to make a religious pronouncement. Because we are incarcerated men and there are no women in this prison, from this moment on, I hereby ordain gay sex is completely permissible. Sex between men is it considered a serious crime, or it's defined legally as a serious crime in PNG and also in Iran. Maysam the whore's declaration is greeted by the audience with joyous laughter and cheering. Then Maysam strips off his clothes to reveal modified red underwear tucked into his buttocks. The performances by Maysam and his friends are watched from a distance by the Australian guards. The prisoners are aware of the guards, and in reaction to the jailers' disapproving gazes, they become more joyous and raucous. On Buchani's reading, their joy is partly revenge against the guards, a way of celebrating despite the prison's best efforts to produce them as nothing but suffering subjects. Everything is interconnected: joy, fear, hate, envy, revenge, spite, even kindness. All these moving pieces revolve around Meysam Mahor, and he revolts against everything. There is no secret underlying his popularity other than an accumulation of suffering by the prisoners, which shines through his rhythmic movements. Like a mirror, the prisoners see themselves reflected in him. Someone who is so brave and creative, he flexes these attributes through his muscles he uses to challenge the hierarchical system of the prison. He employs a beautiful form of rebellion that has enormous appeal for the prisoners. A man with boyish features who uses them to peddle poetry and to satirize all the serious aspects of the forlorn prison. The spirit of Meysam Mahor contrasts with the desert of solitude and the horror of the prison. This is like a reward for the prisoners, a gift in the form of a collective response, a collaborative effort among men who have been banished, a gift that is grasped at, a gift that they will hold on to. Perhaps these eruptions of energetic activity among the celebrating men can be read in excess of a reaction against the guards and the collective self-delusion about the horror of the prison. Perhaps they can also be understood as lines of flight, even if they are only fleeting moments of freedom from the emotional jails which the men fall back into once the noisy celebrations of Meysam, his dancing friends, and the jubilant audience are over. I don't wish to overstate this. Meysam Mahor's performances are a feature of the first few months of the prisoner's survival in the compound. As time passes, Bachani says that the pretend celebrations of Meysam and his friends prove to be no match, that's a quote, for the grinding coercion of the prison. Meysam and his friends stop performing and retreat to their rooms. Even Meysam becomes solitary and starts to deteriorate. So the next section is called Collective Autonomy. In the wake of the PNG Supreme Court's judgment that the containment of asylum seekers against their will was unconstitutional, the Australian government announced that the processing centre would cease operations on the 31st of October 2017, and that the men would be moved to 3 smaller so-called open processing centres near Lorengau. For months leading up to the closure of the prison, the men were put under intense pressure to relocate to the new so-called processing centres. After years of detention, many had become institutionalised, and while they found living at the prison was very difficult, they'd formed communities and were reluctant to be split up and moved to new camps. They were also frightened to leave the camp where they were because some of the men had been bashed and robbed in the Manus community in the months since the prison gates had been opened in daylight hours. Many had been threatened by local people who were affronted about sharing their small island with 1,000 foreign men. In August of that year, an Iranian man, Hamed Shamshiripur, was found hanging in a tree dead. Before his death, he'd been living chaotically. This is quoting from an article co-authored with Bachani in The Guardian. He'd been living chaotically and had made trouble with local Manusian people. His death intensified the refugees' fears of moving to a new location near the town. So when the prison was closed formally, 600 men decided that they would stay on in the compound and resist their forced removal to the new camps. Their decision to stay was not only a reaction to the possible dangers of moving near Lorengau. The men wanted to assert authority over their situation. For 23 days, the men stayed at the prison, which they re-territorialised into a collectively governed community and an ongoing peaceful protest against their imprisonment and their instrumentalisation as objects in an Australian political debate. They faced extreme hardship. The The men were threatened with violent attack and removal by the authorities at any time, and the water and power had been cut off, and they had no food or medicine. After some difficult days, this is quoting from Bachani's journalism mostly. After some difficult days, the men were able to organise a democratic system to manage their basic needs. At daily meetings, everyone was able to propose ideas which were discussed and voted on. The refugees divided into teams to manage various tasks. Engineers among the men converted rubbish bins and tanks to harvest rainwater and gave advice on how to dig wells and keep them clean. Other men kept watch for attacks from the authorities. The national communities, such as the Kurds, the Iranians, Iraqis, Sudanese, Somalis, and a group composed of people without a nationality, took equal turns with jobs such as cleaning the bathrooms. With the help of Manusian allies, some refugees were able to sneak into Lorengau to source food. And while the men never had enough to eat, what they did have was shared equally among the men and the dogs who'd come to live with them. The refugees engaged with the international media on mobile phones, and some journalists were smuggled into the camp to get news out about the refugees' situation. The men also relied on collaborations with a network of friends and comrades in Australia and Manus for advice and support. Bachani was dragged away from the camp, the autonomous camp, by the police. And the next day, the day after he was taken away, the remaining men, there were hundreds of men there, were beaten up by the PNG authorities, and the autonomous camp was violently broken up. Bachani's A Letter from Manus Island was composed in the immediate wake of being dragged away from the autonomous camp. He describes this letter as a poetic manifesto that speaks in a collective voice about the values to which the refugees dedicated themselves during this protest. This extraordinary text elaborates the philosophy of the men. Bachani says that their principles were of love, friendship, and brotherhood. In contrast to the mere spectacle of Australian democracy, the men established and lived a real democracy. Our resistance is the spirit that haunts Australia. Our resistance is a new manifesto for humanity and love. In any case, our resistance and the 3 weeks of hardship we endured produced a new perspective and method that was remarkably transformative, even for us within Manus Prison. We learnt that humans have no sanctuary except within other human beings. Humans have no felicitous way to live their lives other than to trust in other humans and the hearts of other humans and the warmth within the hearts of other humans. Bachani's account of the collective philosophy or politics that grew among the men resonates with his description of the brotherhood that emerged within the prison. Where the brotherhood of the refugees under the rule of the immigration detention regime was severely restricted by the prison that caged them, the 3-week autonomous camp was an event in which practices of love, friendship, and brotherhood were able to flourish and to generate a collective freedom among the men. This freedom is not an abstract concept of liberty which belongs by right to an abstract individual. And nor is it, I think, I'd be interested to hear what people think about this, a space of freedom between governed and governors that Foucault delineates in his later work. In the 3 weeks in which the 600 men took control of the space of the prison to make the autonomous camp in their relations with each other, they governed themselves, and this was a kind of collective freedom. I suppose you could say they were governors and governed in Foucault's terms. For these 23 days before our violent removal, we experienced for the first time in over 4 years some sense of autonomy, but it was not individualistic or rationalistic. Propelled by the deprivation of our liberty, we found an autonomy embedded in social relationships and shared experience. In giving primacy to relations of care and cooperation, We did not compromise our autonomy, but instead made it possible. We became free only in relation to others. This was compassion, egalitarianism, and interdependence in direct opposition to oppression and domination. It was the embodiment of feminist values, but it emerged and was nurtured among hundreds of incarcerated men. So what he calls values in this passage, and this is from an article in Arena magazine, aligns with what he describes as feelings in the Poetic Manifesto, a letter from Manus. On my reading, feelings are intrinsically linked to values in Bachani's thought. Feelings are central to the practices of self-government, and they are at work in practices of care and cooperation, which Bachani defines as feminist. In the Poetic Manifesto, Bachani concludes that the sentiments that were generated are something people need more of in Australia and elsewhere. So again, the terms are very similar to the ones in the autonomy, the text which emphasizes values of autonomy. Feelings of friendship, feelings of compassion, feelings of companionship, feelings of love. I left out justice. Feelings of justice and feelings of love. The next section is called Toward the Ecosystem. While Bachani emphasizes the importance of human values and feelings, this is not an individualistic liberal humanism. On the contrary, these values and feelings arise from something collective and something beyond rationality. What arises involves solidarity between non-human animals, plants, and people in excess of the postures of human subjectivity produced and reproduced by Manus prison theory. Bachani says that in the face of the extreme violence of Manus prison theory, the refugees were pushed towards the ecosystem. Bachani develops the idea of finding connection with the more than human ecology of Manus in No Friend But the Mountains. So, for instance, prior to the prison's closure, the men were confined to the compound by razor wire fences. The fences were only 10 meters from the ocean. And in this period, the refugees find comfort in the company of the sea every day. It is easy to connect with the sea that lies beyond our reach. The men are also watched, that's his expression, by the lines of coconut trees which lie between the ocean and the fences. Bachani suggests that the trees are witnesses to the men's suffering. And chalker birds, which are sacred to the Manusian people, are presented as witnesses and companions to the men in No Friend But the Mountains and the documentary Chalker, Please Tell Us the Time. Chalker birds, the trees, and the ocean share feelings with the men in a more than human connection, a more than human solidarity. These connections, these relations, are intrinsic to autonomous collective government. In one sense, this more than human solidarity, I'm speaking of the camp here. In one sense, this more than human solidarity was destroyed when the authorities broke up the camp and forced the men into new camps near Lorengau. In another sense, Bachani suggests that the collective freedom of the autonomous camp generated a new politics of feeling between the men and the milieu in which they lived. I think this should be understood as the creation of a people and of a world which constitutes a different kind of politics than that of the regimes of governmentality which are hegemonic in Australia and the neoliberal regimes that striate so much of the planet. Manus prison theory is a regime of annihilation, but there are, and there always will be, spirits of resistance. The spirits of resistance are feelings and practices of collective freedom, and they exist beyond the order of progressive chronological time. what is enacted by these fierce resistors are forms of politicization that exceed the techniques of power correlated with multinational economies and bureaucratic states. And they have much to teach those of us striving to find ways to generate, ways to live beyond the death projects of coloniality. That's the end of the talk. And how do I stop sharing? Over here. Okay.
Sorry, I have to stop the recording.